Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the exciting topic, why Switzerland beats Germany for tech workers with kids. When you're hearing this, you might actually be surprised, so listen up carefully what I'm going to have to say in this video. When you have kids, moving to a new country stops being a lifestyle decision and becomes a long-term strategy for your family. And yet most people reduce this decision to salaries, taxes, or childcare costs, even though those numbers alone say very little about whether a move could actually work for you. I know this because I've made this decision myself. I emigrated, rebuilt my life in a completely new country, and went through the exact same thought process that you are probably in right now. In this video, I will walk you through the key factors that matter for tech workers with kids. We're going to look at money, career progression, education, and daily life. And you're going to need to watch until the end to see the full picture. Only then will it become clear why Switzerland works for some families but not others.
I heard that Switzerland was really expensive in terms of childcare. Why are you saying that Switzerland is better for some families than Germany or other countries?
Now, you might have heard from friends and family, Reddit, Facebook, or wherever you get your information that childcare is really expensive in Switzerland. And that is true. You're looking at about 3,000 francs per month for full-time childcare. Some places might even be a bit more if you actually need 5 days per week. But the truth is also that if you look at Germany in comparison, then you might also end up with a bill of about 1,000 euros per month, which is of course less, but it's still quite a lot for the salaries that you are going to have in cities like Munich, Berlin, or Hamburg. The main difference is probably that Germany does have some public childcare, which is usually much less expensive. But the problem is it's not so likely that you will get a placement, like there's usually long waiting lists. So you might actually end up paying the higher childcare fees. And also a main difference is that, of course, if you want like a better or more comprehensive form of childcare where foreign languages are, for example, taught, then you will typically find that in the private childcare options and not in the public options, which are cheaper. If you want to go for the maximum, then you're going to have to pay for private childcare in both Switzerland and Germany. One main difference, though, is that in Germany it tends to be easier to get subsidies. So even if you go with private childcare, you might get some subsidies, whereas in Switzerland, subsidies for childcare are typically limited to the really lower income families. So like I would say at best the lower middle class families. So as a software engineer, typically your salary will be too high and you're not going to get subsidies in most places at least. Always depends on your individual situation, always do the individual math, but just like as a ballpark orientation. But the really important bottom line here is that families tend to pay for private childcare in both countries, both Germany, which has public options, but also Switzerland, where private childcare is the norm in both countries. You often end up paying for private childcare.
Will these high costs continue until my child turns 18?
You should really look at the time horizon, because the thing is that in the shorter run, and by shorter run I mean like 1 to 4 years, typically you don't move to a country for just 1 year, you move for many years. The cost of childcare is temporary. In Switzerland, children typically go to kindergarten when they turn 4 years old. So from like 0 to 4 years old, that's the time frame when you need childcare, basically for the time that you cannot do it on your own. The time where you're going to pay a lot of money for private childcare in Switzerland is limited. The delta you get from lower net salaries, both from taxes and salary levels in Germany, is persistent. And this in the long run very often can actually move the whole calculation in favor of Switzerland. Over time, not only will this cost go away, but you will actually profit more from lower taxes and higher salary because you tend to get promoted and then you profit more from the Swiss system in the longer run, in the later years. Whereas in Germany, in the shorter term, it will sound like a much nicer deal, right? You're saving like 2,000, 2,500 euros per month. But you're paying more taxes, and then you're basically paying it back in the years later, or also the years prior. If you don't have kids yet, you're basically paying into the system in Germany, whereas in Switzerland, you only have to bear this cost for those crucial years of 0 to 4. In the longer run, Switzerland often wins this calculation. And then let's look at the taxes just for a moment here. So it's important that you always do the exact math for your case, but I just want to give you one example to basically get the thoughts going. If you look at the difference in income tax and you have maybe one child right now that would require private childcare for like full time, we said earlier we're looking at a cost of ballpark 3,000 Swiss francs per month. If you're a senior software engineer, your salary in Switzerland will often be roughly 10,000, maybe more Swiss francs per month before taxes. Now, the really interesting thing is if you look at the difference in taxation, and this again, it's highly different which cities you're actually comparing. But let's say we compare Munich to Zurich or Zug, then we have a difference in taxation of roughly 30%. The delta that you pay in taxes and social security between Munich and Zurich and surroundings is in the same ballpark region of childcare for one child. But as I said earlier, this delta in Germany, it persists in the long run, even if your children are already above 4 years old, or even if you don't have children yet. So in Germany, you're basically paying for childcare your whole life, whereas in Switzerland, you only pay for the childcare from like 0 to 4 years old. And then, of course, if you have an even higher salary because you're already a manager and you maybe make 200K per year, you're already saving money in Switzerland. Of course, on the other side, if you have 2 kids and you're maybe making only 100K and you're the only earner in the family, the calculation is different. In this case, Switzerland, at least in the short run, is probably not the best bet financially for you. But then, of course, if you're actually the only earner, the question is, will you really need childcare, or will you need it that much? If your partner doesn't work or doesn't work that much, maybe only part-time, then you probably don't need that much childcare. If you send your kids to daycare like every day of the week, then there should probably be more income because there's time to work in the week, right? We can actually calculate your case in a consulting session and figure out which country is better for your specific case, or maybe the case you're applying for in 2-3 years down the line. Another really important factor is how it compounds over time. Very roughly said, in Germany, you have a bit of a flatter progression. Cost stays more or less the same because when you have kids in this important age range, then the cost isn't that high. But the taxes are high all the time. In Switzerland, it's different. When you're single, it's like a paradise, your taxes are very low and there's no childcare cost involved. And then all of a sudden, once you have kids for the first 4 years, they're really, really expensive in comparison. But then once they're 4 years old, they're not so expensive anymore, and probably also your salary goes up. So you profit super linearly from the lower tax rates in Switzerland. Whereas in Germany, once the kids are 3 years old and they go to kindergarten or they go to school at 6, you don't really profit from that. It's not like your taxes go down or your cost improves or your salary goes up that much. Like even if you get promoted, you actually benefit sublinearly from this change afterwards. So this is why very often Germany will feel like the easier to understand option, but if you do the math, very often in the long run, in Switzerland, you will actually end up with more money, even if you have, let's say, 2 kids, and even if they need to actually go to this expensive 3K per month daycare. Even then, very often the calculation in the long run actually favors Switzerland. But of course, it makes a bit of a difference where you actually work. So if you work in high margin businesses, then yes, this can really work out for you. Whereas if you work in like lower income businesses, then you have to review this carefully. So if you're currently running these comparisons for your own family and you're not sure how your situation would play out in the long term, then let's have a call and figure this out together. We can look at your career path together, your family setup, and of course also your timeline, and see which country actually makes sense for you, be it Germany, Switzerland, or also another country. You'll find a link to speak with me down in the description.
Raphael, which education system is better for my children? Switzerland's or Germany's?
I'm sure you did some research about the education system in Switzerland and also in Germany and maybe some more countries, because of course this is really, really important for your kids. If you look at the numbers, let's say the famous PISA study, where they compare math, science, reading abilities, and more across various highly developed countries, then you will realize that Switzerland has better scores, especially in math and science, than Germany. Although, of course, both countries are at a relatively high level globally, like depending on where you're coming from, both countries will be an improvement. It just is undeniable that Switzerland does have a clear edge in the PISA study over Germany. And I would say overall, Switzerland is just stronger in terms of technical education outcomes, especially if you're basically aiming for the upper end of education. If you really, really want to give your kids the absolute best, then I would say Switzerland clearly has the edge right now. But of course, there's also a few downsides or limitations. If you basically assume a progression of your kids go to school in case A, Germany, and then they also maybe go to university in Germany 20 years later, it is undeniable that in Germany, it tends to be a bit easier to actually go basically from like kindergarten to university, whereas in Switzerland, the system is a bit more selective. And the reason is that it's two slightly different systems. On the upside, in Switzerland, though, it's completely okay if your child doesn't make it to ETH or EPFL, whereas in Germany, I would say if you extend the current development into the future, people might take your kids less seriously or look down upon them a little bit if they don't make it to some university or at the very least some Fachhochschule. The high performers, and especially like the more theoretical people who end up being architects and whatnot in the end, they tend to be grouped together more in Switzerland, whereas in Germany everything is a bit broader and a bit more mixed, which has pros and cons. Less specific support for really, really gifted people in Germany, but of course also broader access to universities in the end. And if you look at the availability of childcare and schools in Switzerland, it is more expensive, but it is more organized and more available, especially in terms of special options if you want to send your kids to like a Montessori school or all sorts of specialized schools for certain needs and certain specializations, so foreign languages, stuff like that. You will find this easier in Switzerland. It will come at a higher cost, but of course, your salaries are going to be higher. So if you're a high-performing software engineer, then this might actually be a really good trade-off for you and your family. Whereas in Germany, everything is a bit cheaper, actually less organized. The availability is not so good, often in terms of specialized support for children or foreign languages, math, music, teaching, or you have to organize all of this yourself. So Germany tends to be a bit less organized about this. The cost is lower. So for example, if you have a lot of children or your salary is more on the lower end, Germany can still be the better deal for you.
Money is one thing, but where do you get more time with your kids?
The systems in terms of parental leave in Germany and Switzerland are a bit different, actually quite a bit different. In Germany, it's much more state-controlled. As parents, you can, if you split it, for example, 7 months and 7 months or 12 months and 2 months, you can actually get that. You will not get your full salary, so many people don't seem to get that your salary will actually be significantly lower in this time, but at least you cannot be fired and you still get like a low salary on the time of parental leave. In Germany, it's more normal to actually take maybe like 2.5 years for both parents, whereas in Switzerland, this is more rare. Why? Because in Switzerland, the system is very different. It's not really controlled very much by the government. The government gives mothers about 14 weeks of motherhood leave. The mother will have like a bit of a lower salary, but also cannot be fired in that time. In some jobs just comes the expectation that after 14 weeks or so, the mother will start working again. It's not like it's a legal obligation because nobody says you have to, but this is realistically what a lot of people do. And then for fathers, the paid time is only 2 weeks. And now here comes the main difference. So in Switzerland, the assumption is basically that you have your children maybe when you're 30, 35, something like this. So you started saving for your kids when you were 22, 25. So by the time you have kids, you have like a lot of money on your bank account. So you could actually afford to take some unpaid leave. Nobody really forces you to go straight back to work unless you really need the money. And that's really the point. Once you have kids, you should have a lot of savings, so you shouldn't, worry about the next paycheck. If you do, then at least in the Swiss system and under the Swiss perception, you're doing something wrong because saving money, even in younger years, is something that is culturally very, very important in Switzerland. And now I know that a lot of people struggle and might not actually make this. But if you're a software engineer, the calculation usually works in your favor. If you're a software engineer, usually you have such a high salary that unless you really splurge and spend tons of money on rent because you live in the city center, which is usually not necessary, or you have a very expensive car, vacations or whatnot, then you should actually have a lot of savings. If you're in your 30s, you should probably have at least 100,000 Swiss francs in your bank account of savings. And then, at least from a financial standpoint, it is actually possible to take off a full year, like maybe even both of you, for taking care of your first or second child. And yeah, of course, you have to align this with your employer. But again, as a software engineer, it's easier to find a job. This is why for software engineers and highly paid people, the Swiss system often tends to be better, because if you actually save money, if you actually plan for all of this, and you benefit more in the long term from the low taxes, it will in the long run be in your favor. Whereas the German system, it's a very different culture. It's more state organized. If you don't have any savings, if you don't plan, basically the government has you, whereas the Swiss government doesn't have you. You have to do it on your own. But it comes at a very high cost. In the German system, you don't get a full salary. The salary while you are on parental leave is actually relatively low. And of course, taxes are high all the time. In the Swiss system, planning and savings are required, but it will overall reward you in the longer run. The German system doesn't really require much planning or savings, but in the longer run, it will actually punish you, because you're paying way more into the German system as a software engineer and high income earner than you would in the Swiss system.
What about the day-to-day? Which country feels more modern and hassle-free?
Transport is also 2026 quite different. The Swiss public transportation is really reliable. Trains are typically on time. There's delays sometimes, but there's so many delays in Germany, and it's not really getting any better. Maybe in 20 years, I really hope it will be better in Germany, but right now, Switzerland, in terms of public transportation, has a clear edge over practically every part of Germany. It doesn't matter if you're in Munich, if you're in Hamburg, in Berlin. It's not really reliable anywhere in Germany, unfortunately, which can be a big factor if you have kids and you need to go to work, you need to be on time, etc. Switzerland has the clear edge here.
As a developer, you notice friction more than anyone. Does that daily friction eventually lead to burnout for a family?
This lower friction that you have in your everyday life in Switzerland, it clearly compounds over the years. If you only look at a day, a week, you will not really notice the difference. But over the years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, this really compounds. You can focus more on work on the one side and, just spending fun quality time with your kids on the other hand, because you have to worry less about those infrastructural deficiencies that Germany, quite frankly, has.
What critical mistake do most software engineers make when choosing between countries?
They optimize too much for the next 1 or 2 years. Because usually if you move to a country, then you don't want to do it for just 1 or 2 years. You want to do it for the next 10 years or something. That means that you should do the math in the long run. And as I explained earlier, one of those 2 countries will clearly be the winner for you, and you should really optimize for the longer run. You should really factor in all of these different variables, because if you don't, then you will end up with the wrong country. And as you know, moving countries, it's a very big thing. Once you've done it once, then it's really hard to move on to another country. If this comparison helped you see Switzerland and Germany more clearly, the next step is to make sure that you don't repeat the same mistakes that most people make when moving abroad. In my next video, I will break down the 8 most costly mistakes I see over and over again, especially among software engineers and tech professionals. These are the mistakes that will not show up in tax comparisons, but end up costing people time, money, and long-term stability after they've already moved. If you want to protect the decision you're about to make and want to avoid problems that are hard to fix once you've already moved abroad, watch the next video. See you there.